Hi, boys and girls. My name is Mrs. Hardwick, and I teach second grade at University Place Primary. And today you are going to be learning about Susan B. Anthony. So this is our domain, Fighting for a Cause. Our learning target for this domain is to be able to identify the causes and contributions that people fought for during their lifetime. One of our vocabulary words is inequality. That is the condition of not being treated the same as others. For example, in this picture, the man is making more money than the woman. That's inequality. It's not fair. Another vocabulary word is segregation. That is the practice of keeping groups of people separate or apart due to reasons such as race. For example, in our past, people of color and white people have gone to different schools when segregation was occurring. And here you see a sign, drinking fountain. Two separate drinking fountains. So that is called segregation. The next word is activists. People who take some kind of action to achieve a goal. So for this one, I chose a picture of kids actually being the activists. It says, cool kids saving a hot planet. The next word is suffrage. That is the right to vote. And the next word is discrimination. An act of unfair treatment of a person or group of people based on traits such as skin color, race, or religion. So these birds are discriminating against this bird. Maybe because it has different colored feathers. During this read aloud, be watching for the answers to these questions. Question number 1, for what causes did Susan B. Anthony fight for in her lifetime? Question number 2, what is an abolitionist? And also, why do you think Susan B. Anthony became an abolitionist? And the last question is, apart from her newspaper, how else did Susan B. Anthony fight for women's rights? All right, let's get started on our story. Susan B. Anthony, an advocate for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony was born a very long time ago in Massachusetts in the year 1820. When she was a little girl, she did not know that she would grow up to become so influential. The word influential means having the ability to change people's minds or to convince them of something. But becoming influential was to be her destiny. Her family certainly helped to shape the person she was to become. Susan's family was different from many other families. They were Quakers. So Quakers are members of a religious group called the Religious Society of Friends. And Quakers believe that all people are equal. Susan's family did not judge people based on color or whether they were male or female. In their eyes, everyone was equal. But a long time ago, when Susan was a young girl, not everyone thought that way. For one thing, many people thought that it was more important for boys to be educated than it was for girls or people of color. How would you have felt about that? How would you feel if only boys could go to school? Susan was lucky because her parents did not agree with this view. They wanted their daughter to receive a good education. When Susan was 6 years old, she went to school. One day, a teacher at the school refused to teach Susan a difficult math problem because she was a girl. As a result, her parents decided that Susan should be educated at home. Later, Susan attended a Quaker boarding school near Philadelphia. So a boarding school is one where students live at the school rather than go home at the end of the school day. When her parents struggled to pay the fees, however, she left school and finished her education at home. Later, Susan became a teacher. Susan eventually became a headmistress, or the person in charge of a school. Susan worked hard to help her family financially. Susan quickly discovered, though, that female teachers earned less money than male teachers for doing the very same job. When Susan was 29 years old, she left the world of education and settled in her family home. Susan's family was now living near Rochester in New York. It was during this time that she met some very brave people who were trying to abolish or end slavery in the United States. Slavery is when people are forced to work for no pay and are not free to make decisions about their own lives. These people who were trying to abolish slavery were called abolitionists. Secret meetings were held late at night in her family home. Susan became involved too. Her heart began to tell her that it was important that she try to make the world a fairer place. So Susan decided that she would join the fight to abolish slavery. So remember, that means end slavery. A long and difficult journey had begun. In the early days of the Civil War, Susan helped to organize women's groups to speak out about slavery. This was not an easy thing to do. Back then, people did not have computers or cell phones. Susan and her supporters had to travel in horse-drawn carriages and communicate by letter. Newspapers printed many articles that criticized her views and called her a troublemaker. Susan did not care. She was fearless. That means she had no fear. While the Civil War raged in January 1863, President Abraham Lincoln took an important step toward ending slavery when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation, or statement, announced that the government intended to free all slaves in the United States. This meant that former slaves could make decisions about their own lives and that they could receive money for the work they did. In December 1865, after the Civil War, slavery was abolished or ended completely. In the next few years after the Civil War, the law was changed so that former slaves became citizens, and male slaves were given the right to vote. Susan was very happy that former male slaves had gained these rights. She was extremely unhappy that women did not have the same rights. The next fight was about to begin. So for Susan and many others, they did not want to fight like the kind of violent fights that happen in a war. For them, the fight was one in which they would work hard to end the unfairness they saw. It might be difficult to believe now, but when Susan was alive, women had very few rights. As you have discovered, back then, many people did not think that it was important to educate girls. Women had very limited roles or small jobs in their communities. They could attend meetings, but were not allowed to speak in public, hold office, or vote. Women were not allowed to become doctors or lawyers. Few girls stayed in school beyond the 8th grade. Married women could not own property. If they did own property before they got married, they had to turn it over to their husbands after they got married. Susan had hoped that former abolitionists would now support women's rights. She was disappointed to discover that many men who had helped to abolish slavery did not believe that women should have suffrage, or the right to vote. Susan was determined to change this view. Susan joined forces with two women named Amelia Bloomer and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Together they began to fight for women's rights. Women like Susan, who campaigned against these laws, became known as suffragettes, or people who fought for women's suffrage. And again, remember, suffrage means the right to vote. Susan became secretary of the American Equal Rights Association. She traveled all over the country by wagon, carriage, and train, speaking for women's suffrage. She organized petitions and clubs, and she wrote newspaper articles. Susan also became publisher of The Revolution, which was a newspaper dedicated to women's issues. So a publisher is a person in charge of the newspaper. Printed on the front page of this newspaper were the words, "Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." Susan invested her own money in the newspaper. Continuing the fight for women's rights, Susan also helped to found or start the National Suffrage Association. When Susan ran out of money, she gave up her position at the newspaper and had to find another way to make money. She began to tour the country, speaking to groups that paid to hear her speak. Susan was in her 50s when she took her campaign one step further. She tried to cast her vote for president. She and several other women marched into a New York barbershop where male voters were voting. The women held a protest. They demanded the right to vote. The men in charge were unsure of what to do. They were unable to stop the women, so the women finally voted in the election. And so, in 1872, about 50 years before it was legal to do so, Susan and the other women cast their ballots for President of the United States. So ballots are pieces of paper which are used to cast votes. 2 weeks later, Susan was arrested and charged with illegal voting. Her arrest caused a national uproar. Susan was not afraid. She asked the general public to consider, is it a crime for a United States citizen to vote? The judge in her trial did not think women should have the right to vote. He decided against Susan before the trial even started. He did not let her talk. He ordered the jury to find her guilty. He then asked Susan if she had anything to say. "I have many things to say, for in your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored." So basically, Susan was saying that her rights were being violated, not only because she could not legally vote, but because the judge didn't even let her talk at her own trial. The judge tried to quiet Susan, but she continued to speak. He sentenced her to pay a fine of $100. Susan's response was to say, "I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty." And she never did. By the end of the 19th century, which means the late 1800s, people's views about Susan B. Anthony began to change. She had become a national heroine. Susan continued to travel the country speaking for women's voting rights. Now, people couldn't wait to hear her speak. She became president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, a job she held until the age of 80, when she retired. 6 years later, on March 13th, 1906, Susan B. Anthony died in Rochester, New York. She had worked for more than 50 years, a half a century, for women's rights. Although she did not live to see women get the right to vote when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution passed in 1920, she had definitely helped to make it happen. Susan B. Anthony was quite an amazing woman. She was prepared to stand up and fight for what she believed was right. Do you think you would have had enough courage to do the same? So that is the end of our read aloud. Don't forget to answer the 3 questions and turn them into your teacher. Bye.